Hello, and thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is Susan Stark, and the title of my paper is Reparation, Responsibility, and White Identity. The United States, its settlers, its predecessor colonies, and its members attempted genocide of Native and Indigenous peoples and kidnapped and enslaved Africans and African Americans. These actions and policies, sustained over centuries, are part of the founding and inextricably linked to the development of the United States. As awareness of this morally wrong and criminal history grows, so do calls to repair these wrongs that occurred in the past, but whose legacies persist into the present. Insofar as our focus is on past wrongs as opposed to present injustices, the defender of reparations faces several problems. First, those who have perpetuated these wrongs existed in the past, and these individuals specifically no longer exist. To argue for reparations in the present requires that it is possible for humans who currently exist to repair wrongs done by others who no longer exist. Secondly, and relatedly, those who have been wronged by these past deeds are similarly no longer in existence. Nothing can be done for them specifically to repair the wrongs they have experienced and the harms that stem from those wrongs. My approach in this paper is to address the objections to reparations and develop an account of the defense of reparation making that deals with these objections. Here's an overview of what I'll do in this talk today. I begin with the so-called intergenerational harm argument, which is one plausible argument that aims to address this problem about past wrongs. I discuss several problems with the intergenerational harm argument and then set that view aside. I then defend an alternative account of reparations. This argument requires the successful defense of four claims. They are: white humans across time occupying or having occupied the land now recognized as the United States are a group. Second, this group is responsible for racial oppression in this land. Third, individual members of this group bear partial responsibility for actions, policies, and practices of the group as a whole. And finally, individual members of the group have what I call a perfect duty of justice to repair wrongs done by the group as a whole. Now that's clearly a lot, and so today I just defend the first of these claims: white humans across time occupying or having occupied the land now recognized as the United States are a group. Okay, so let's talk about the intergenerational harm argument and some problems with it. The intergenerational harm argument says wrongs done in the past cause intergenerational harm or trauma in the present. Another way to put this is to say that past wrongs have downstream effects that extend into the present and even beyond the present into the future. Bernard Boxhill calls this argument the continuing harm argument. There are several problems with this argument. One is that it depends on causal relations being in existence and strong between the past wrongs and the present harms. And it is open to be questioned. Derek Darby, for instance, offers this line of argument that these causal relations are strongly linked, the past wrongs and the present harms. Another problem is the so-called non-identity problem. On this view, were it not for the past wrongs, those who are continuing to be harmed in existence today would not exist if those past wrongs had not been committed. And finally, a third problem with the intergenerational harm argument is that because what is being addressed is harm in the present, not wrong, arguments that we are required to address these harms are akin to arguments that we are required to address other forms of harm. For instance, the harm that comes from natural disasters, the harm that comes from political instability, or even the harm that can come from negligence, for instance. And many people regard these as imperfect duties. We have an obligation to benefit others, to help them out when they're in a tough spot, but we don't have any kind of more stringent moral duty than that. My aim, by contrast, is to develop an account of reparations that does have a more stringent moral duty attached to the obligation to make repair. That my view understands the moral obligation to repair as a perfect duty to repair wrongs for which the repairer bears some measure of moral responsibility. Okay, so a part of my view holds that white humans in the present, in the land that is currently recognized to be the United States, are a group. So one thing that is the defining feature of this group is the idea of whiteness. And so this immediately brings up a question: what is my view about races? Are there races? According to my view, race is a fully socially constructed category, not at all a biological category. There are no kinds at the genetic level that map onto categories at the social or phenotypic level. Race is fully socially constructed. On the view of race that I adopt, human hierarchy is a central notion. The idea that some groups of humans are better or have more morally good attributes than other groups of humans. And certainly this view is not new. It's been around in its current form for at least 500 years, but it certainly predated the white supremacy and views that are in the present. Plato, for instance, in his view of genos, and Aristotle, in his view of ethnos, had something like a human hierarchy view that they held. Plato, of course, held that there were different kinds of souls: gold, silver, and bronze souls. Aristotle, by contrast, held that the Greeks were superior to other races, Asians and Northern Europeans and Africans among them. Kant is widely known to have held that, this is a quote, humanity is at its greatest perfection in the race of the whites, a kind of bald white supremacy in Kant's view. And in contemporary writers, Ibram Kendi argues that in the 17th and 18th centuries, in what would become the United States, legal cases and early legislation in the American colonies began to establish legal distinctions between black and white humans, and began to establish the notion that white humans were at the top of this hierarchy. So that provides a kind of quick picture of the view of race that I'm going to be talking about in my talk today. So the next question that we need to answer is, do white humans constitute a group? And to make this argument, I rely on the view of Larry May, who argued that groups have three attributes. First, they are composed of individual humans. And regarding this attribute of groups, I assume this is correct and do not discuss this in any depth. Second, May argued that humans who are in a group, a putative group, are related to one another by organizational structure, solidarity, or common interests. And the third attribute of groups is, May argued that individual group members are identifiable both to members of the group, what I call in-group members, and to those who are not members of the group, what I call out-group members. And so in this conversation, in this discussion, I'm going to focus on attributes 2 and 3. Okay, so let's think about that second criterion, that groups are related by organizational structure, solidarity, and common interests. So you can think of many examples of entities that would meet this criterion. Corporations would meet this criterion. Nonprofit institutions like colleges or schools would meet this criterion. Clubs or sports, clubs like stamp collectors, sports groups like Ultimate Frisbee Club or Ultimate Frisbee Group, as well as political groups like Democratic Socialists of America. All of those groups would meet May's criterion in sharing organizational structure or solidarity or common interests. Organizations may embody one, two, or all three of these attributes. Corporations maybe have one, a common organizational structure. A Montessori school maybe shares an organizational structure as well as solidarity, possibly also common interests. A historically black college or university may share all three. These organizations, however, differ from racial groups in the attribute of choice. That is, these organizations that I've listed above, group membership involves choice. Individuals decide to take a job at a corporation or at a nonprofit, or they volunteer as in a nonprofit, or they join a stamp collectors club or a political group. Not so with racial groups. So according to May's criteria, it looks like racial groups don't count as groups. So we need to think about, is choice necessary for a collective of individuals to be a group? And here we can think about Kwame Anthony Appiah's view, which is that racial or other forms of identity is not simply a matter of choice or what he calls intentional identification, but it is also determined by cultural scripts for that identity. He says, there is in all identities a set of theoretically committed criteria for ascription of the identity, and, he says, the label shapes the intentional acts of those who fall under it. So all sorts of aspects of identity are determined by the culture in which we find ourselves, and they're not simply up for our own choosing. You can think of some examples of this. The one-drop rule, which was used to categorize any individual who had even one drop of African blood as black. The Nuremberg race laws, which were used to categorize people as Jewish. And then jump ahead to contemporary times. You have individuals like Rachel Dolezal and Jessica Krug, who both are white but identified as black. And there was a really big outcry from the public and from social media that these two individuals are not black. Or Elizabeth Warren, who does have some Native and Indigenous ancestry, but doesn't really identify strongly or practice culturally as a Native or Indigenous person. And when she became public about her ancestry, it was clear that she was not considered to be a Native or Indigenous person. And Hilaria Baldwin also ran afoul of the public and social media when she claimed to be Spanish, when she is in fact not. So all of these examples seem to show that our identities are not simply up to us. The culture of which we are a part also determines what the scripts, what the constraints, what the opportunities are that we can choose within, but we cannot choose what those scripts are. Individuals can and do choose to form groups, but groups are also formed through the cultural scripts that are constructed over time through institutions and through legal and legislative decisions. Consider another example, U.S. citizen residents of Maine. This seems like a group. Benefits and burdens accrue to its members, but and though some people might choose to be citizens or choose to live in Maine, not all who are under that umbrella do choose to live in Maine or to be citizens of the United States. So, okay, turning to May's third criterion, there needs to be recognition by the in-group and the out-group members. The theoretical underpinning for May on this criterion is that groups need to be public. They cannot be secret if they are going to be groups. Even if we grant that groups need to be public, still it seems like there are at least two ways in which a group might form, and that will affect this recognition criterion. Groups might form through individual member choices. I call this in-group priority, where the members of the group decide to be a group. And then groups might form, as we talked about in criterion 2, through cultural scripts, cultural options, constraints, and choices offered. And so we'll call this out-group priority. The non-members of the group kind of decide what the constraints and parameters of the group are. But you might wonder, does group formation require both in-group identification and also out-group identification, out-group recognition? May thinks it does, so the question is May correct about this? If you didn't have out-group recognition, we would have a secret group, and that would violate May's justification of needing a publicity condition around a group. Without in-group identification, that is, if the out-group is the sole determinant of what the group is, you would have worries about violations of autonomy, potential for oppression, and potential for power imbalances within and between groups. So it seems like you wouldn't want to have groups solely formed without in-group identification. So, considering again the group white humans in the present, across time, in the United States, in the land that is considered to be the United States, does this group have in-group identification, or is it just an out-group identification and therefore runs afoul of May's third criterion? One plausible view is that the imposition of burdens on other racial groups, the internal distribution of benefits to group members, and preventing other outgroup members from sharing in those benefits, that this constitutes a kind of in-group identification. And we have good examples of this historically: real estate loans, redlining, old boy networks for jobs, knowledge about how to be in college, how to be in grad school, law school, med school, the commitment to meritocracy after centuries of exclusionary practices. These all seem like examples of a group identifying with other in-group members, even though they are not, the members are not explicitly identifying with one another. But even if this does not seem to sufficiently constitute an example of in-group identification, there are some who argue that in-group identification is not necessary. There are examples of groups that lack in-group identification. Christian List and Philip Pettit argue that identification does not need to be intentional. They give the example of a crime organization with a network of cells aimed at similar goals, but where the members of these small groups or cells are unaware of the larger purpose of the whole network. And they say this organization would function as an agent, and so this would count as a group. White humans in the land, now recognized as the United States, existing across time, also seems to fit this model. There are some individuals of that group who are creators of the group, some individuals who are perpetuators of the group and aware of a larger purpose connected to racial identity, but most individual members of the group are neither explicitly aware of their association with others nor of any shared purpose through their affiliations. So it seems like we have two options. One is to say that the in-group identification is more implicit, and the other is to say that we allow groups without an explicit in-group identification to count as groups, and so we should for the group white humans as well. So I'm going to end with just mentioning and giving a quick response to a couple objections. One question you might have is, well, who counts as a member of this group? Who is white? And that's definitely a issue that my account owes an answer to. A second objection is that this account exacerbates rather than ameliorates racism, because my account acknowledges and emphasizes white identity. And I'm going to give a couple quick answers. Appia worries about this similarly, that non-intentional identities are a kind of tyranny. A couple answers. Amy Gutman argues that attention to race is acceptable, but must be for the purpose of putting itself out of business so that we no longer pay attention to race. Michelle Moody Adams argues that not all forms of color consciousness or racial identification are pernicious, that it is possible to affirm a psychologically healthy and morally constructive pleasure in recognizing a shared history. And I would simply add that it is psychologically healthy to acknowledge a morally wrongful past. Pablo de Grief makes a similar point, arguing that reparations aim to redress harm to those who were wronged by past policies and actions and practices, but that they also aim to repair the damage that racism has done to white people. And similarly, it seems psychologically healthy to face these past wrongs done by members of this group, white humans. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Feel free to be in touch with me by email, and also if you're interested in a longer paper or citations, please send me an email. Thank you so much.